Hey guys, Rob Skiba here. Okay, this is going to be the second part in a series that I'm doing on the real X-Files. The last one I did was part one, Ancient Hybrid Armies, and I'm going to continue now with part two. This presentation will deal with modern hybridization, and in part three we'll get into the issue of little green men. I was going to include it in this one, but then this one got too long, so I went ahead and made plans for part three that would be just about the little green men, and what was going to be part three is now going to be part four. But all of this is in response to a speech given by U.S. Army General Milley to some ROTC cadets. And just to refresh everyone's memory, here's a little clip from that speech.
If the world of 1916 was complex, or the world of 1945 was complex, the world of 2016 is intensely complex. And I can tell you that from personal experience, and I know there's many others who can tell you that as well. And you will graduate and be in that world, and you're going to be leading the soldiers and the sailors, the airmen and the Marines in that world. You'll be dealing with terrorists, you'll be dealing with hybrid armies, you'll be dealing with little green men. You're going to be dealing with tribes. You'll be dealing with national leaders and local leaders. You'll be dealing with politics and economics. And you'll be dealing with direct fire and indirect fire. And you're going to be dealing with it all. And it's all going to be dealt with simultaneously.
And of course, many people have reported on this story, although it has been, at least in the mind of some, sufficiently debunked regarding what the general actually meant. For instance, there was a video put out by Skywatch TV in which Derek Gilbert gave this response.
These phrases, hybrid armies and little green men, are common in today's military. Hybrid army is a fighting force that incorporates non-traditional elements like drones, robotic weapons, or even private security contractors into the mix. And little green men was a term that developed a couple of years ago when fighting broke out in Ukraine. The separatists were augmented by Russian soldiers wearing masks and plain, unmarked green uniforms. Clearly fighting men, but not obviously identifiable as Russian. Little green men. So, General Milley didn't mean what the internet thinks he meant.
Of course, he then goes on to talk about that doesn't negate the fact that their DARPA and organizations like that are in fact creating super soldiers, and Skywatch TV and the people over there are very much on the leading edge of research and reporting on the transhumanist movement. So they clearly understand all of that, although Derek was just saying, officially, the terms hybrid armies and little green men are common terms apparently used in the military. Now, having been in the military myself, I know that they use code words and different phrases and words that don't necessarily mean the same thing in a military context that they would mean to the average person out on the street. But what I was saying in part one and putting forward for you to consider is, could this all be a psy-op? Everybody likes to talk about psy-ops these days. Oh, that's a psy-op, that's a psy-op. You're just involved with a psy-op. You're a victim of a psy-op. Well, I'm asking, are we being victims of a psy-op in this situation? Because clearly there were hybrids in the ancient world. What has been will be again. We know that Yeshua said in Matthew 24:37, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man, that the last days would be likened unto the days of Noah. And in part one, I went through a whole bunch of stuff showing what was going on in, I believe, the last 120 years leading up to the flood, that being transhumanism in the ancient world, and how it continued in the post-flood world. Well, now I'm going to segue into laying out sort of a timeline of the 20th century and going into the 21st century. There are a lot of really interesting things. You'll notice that General Milley specifically mentioned two dates, the world of 1916 and the world of 1945. Now, of course, obviously, in a military context, we might be thinking, World War I and World War II. And sure, I can go with that. That's probably what he was talking about. However, there were other things leading up to in between and after those years that are very interesting. So what I'm going to do with this part is just sort of lay out a timeline, highlighting a few what I would consider to be Nephilim-related activities that could shed more light on the terms hybrid armies and little green men.
Now let's start to segue into possibility of the Nephilim returning in the last days. Are they coming back? Well, as we talked about earlier, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man, right? We are doing genetic manipulation today. That's in the news on a fairly regular basis.
In fact, here's a recent article. It was published May 16th by someone named Christine Emba. The headline in the Washington Post reads, "Will technology allow us to transcend the human condition?" This person goes on to say, while it may sound like something straight out of a sci-fi film, the United States intelligence community is considering human augmentation and its possible implications for national security. As described in the National Intelligence Council's 2012 Long-Term Strategic Analysis document, the fifth report of its kind, human augmentation is seen as a game changer. The report detailed the potential benefits of brain-machine interfaces and neuro enhancements, noting that, quote, moral and ethical challenges are inevitable, end quote. The NIC analysts aren't the only ones following the rapid growth of technology. Today, there is an entire movement called Transhumanism, dedicated to promoting the use of technological advancements to enhance our physical, intellectual, and psychological capabilities, ultimately transcending the limitations of the human condition. Its proponents claim that within the next several decades, living well beyond the age of 100 will be an achievable goal. And you've heard me talk about, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Well, in the days of Noah lived 950 years, 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood. So if we're going to parallel our days, if we believe we're in the last days, at a time when Christ will soon return, with the days of Noah, then longevity has to be a factor. Transhumanism is one of the ways they intend to make that happen. And yet another reason why I believe we are in a repeat of the days of Noah, or at least beginning to enter that phase. Coined by biologist and eugenicist Julian Huxley, brother of author Aldous Huxley, in 1957, transhumanism remained the terrain of science fiction authors and fringe philosophers for the better part of the 20th century. The movement gained broader interest as science advanced, leaping forward in credibility in the 1990s with the invention of the World Wide Web, the sequencing of the human genome, and the exponential growth of computing power. New technologies continue to push the limits of life, and then they go on to talk about CRISPR technologies. Well, if you click on that link, and I'll leave the link to this article in the description below, click on that link, and that's going to take you to this page right here on nature.com. It's a special page on CRISPR technology. Researchers the world over are fast adopting CRISPR-Cas9 to tinker with the genomes of humans, viruses, bacteria, animals, and plants. Nature brings together research, reporting, and expert opinion to keep you abreast of the frontiers of gene editing. And this is what's so disturbing about this is not only is the technology rather inexpensive, it's basically being put into the hands of just about anybody to be able to start playing around with this technology. Here's a bunch of different articles you can read on it. Just click through the links on this page here. Okay, so this stuff is real. This stuff is really happening. Whether you choose to believe it or not, we are in the days when editing genomes and blending of species is becoming easier and easier, just as it was in the days of Noah.
Remember I told you that the first generation Nephilim, they killed each other off in a civil war, and the Watchers, their parents, were judged, bound, and buried for how long? 70 generations. Good, you remember. Yeah, 70 generations. That is in 1 Enoch chapter 10, verse 12. It talks about that they shall be bound fast for 70 generations. Well, Psalm 90, verse 10 defines a generation as 70 years, 80 if by strength. If we just go with the 70 times 70, 4,900 years. 4,900 years from 3000 BC, which is when I believe that they were finally all done and buried, leads us up to the beginning of the 1900s. Huh. Interesting. We had a flat line of human development for like thousands of years of technology and transportation, horse and buggy beats of burden and stuff like that. All of a sudden, planes, trains, automobiles, supposedly sending men to the moon, and, probes to the farthest reach. How did that happen in like 50 years? Could something have happened that gave us a little bit of help? Well, I started kind of doing a chart looking at various websites and human development and technology and transportation and knowledge and things like that, and found certainly when you get to around the flood, there was a high level. Obviously, a lot of the megalithic structures, I believe a fair amount of them were actually pre-flood structures that still survive to this day. But there's some that show up almost immediately after the timeline of the biblical flood of Noah. So you've got this, pretty high level of intelligence, probably modes of transportation. And then it takes a nosedive at the Tower of Babel. And, well, that makes perfect sense. If you've got all these people and they're gathered together under the leadership of one guy whose plan was actually, if you read the extra biblical text, his plan was to kill God and set himself up as the king of the universe. God comes down, confounds their languages, sends them out, 70 different people groups, 70 different languages, go away, talking about the same guy. Well, I mean, that's great if you've got Einstein in your group, but what if you're stuck with Pee Wee Herman? Okay, our language line is toast, we're going to start over, let's start drawing pictures on cave walls, Oh, here's a horse, So it was a brilliant plan by God to significantly bring wisdom, understanding, and knowledge down. Because what they were planning very shortly after the flood wasn't good. So the Tower of Babel was a brilliant strategy to limit our wisdom, understanding, and knowledge and things of that nature. And there's a few other spikes throughout time, but for the most part, it's pretty much a straight line till you get to the beginning of the 1900s, and now it's like Moore's Law, right? I mean, everything's just, you buy a computer and it's out of date next week. Something's happened. And so I just speculate and wonder, could it be that we are at the end of the 70 generation timeline and that they are progressively being released? And when you look at, there's one of the fallen angels of the book of Enoch was Kazdaja, and he taught the art of killing babies in the womb. Abortion. So many things we can look at. If you look at what the Watchers were teaching men to do in the book of Enoch, it's what we have learned to do again in the last 100 years or so. And then, boy, you start doing this kind of research and all kinds of things start coming your way. How many of you have ever heard the interview I did with Tim Bentz called Canaanite Altars in the Federal Reserve? Have you heard that? A couple of you? Yeah, if you haven't, you want to go on YouTube and do a search for Canaanite Altars in the Federal Reserve. And just to summarize that, G. Edward Griffin wrote a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, and that's the term he used for the Federal Reserve. I don't know if he understands just how right he was by calling it that, the creature from Jekyll Island. He says, the Federal Reserve is a hybrid organization. It is a partnership between the federal government and the private banks. When you look at it deeper than that, its essence is neither as a government agency nor a private company. In reality, it is a cartel. And he goes on to expose it. Well, this is an interesting connection that I recently stumbled upon related to the things that we've just been talking about and looking at. Notice that G. Edward Griffin says that the Federal Reserve is a hybrid organization. He didn't mean this the way that I'm looking at it right now, but I doubt that he knows how true that statement actually was. After the last Future Congress conference, which was a big conference we just had here in Dallas in January, I met a man named Tim Bentz. And Tim had experience in finding and destroying Nephilim altars in the Middle East. He'd find these Canaanite altars that were being dug up in different places in the Middle East. And the Bible says destroy those things, tear those things down. And God has called him to do that, to go and wage spiritual warfare, hardcore spiritual warfare against these ancient demonic sites and structures.
And I recently had him on my radio show, and you might definitely want to check out. It's a 2-part radio interview that I did with Tim Benz. If you go to blogtalkradio.com, blogtalkradio.com/revolutionary radio, and just scroll down and you'll see it's one of the featured episodes. It was called Canaanite Altars and the Federal Reserve. You definitely want to listen to that one. He told me that after dealing with some pretty hardcore spiritual warfare in the Middle East, that the Lord actually called him to go to Jekyll Island, which is where the Federal Reserve was conceived. He went and learned something very interesting about the Fed. He discovered that the buildings that were now there now, were built over an American Indian village. But this was no ordinary American Indian village or tribe. While there, he met a guy who was in charge of a museum on the island, and I'm just going to play a clip from that interview. This is what happened when he met this individual from the museum. At this time, when he first got there to Jekyll Island, he didn't know. He's like, Lord, why am I here? Why are you bringing me to Jekyll Island? And then he found out why the Lord brought him there.
He takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. That tribe was called the Timucas. He said the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built the club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. And so I said, well, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips. And he said, you want to see the bones? And I said, well, yeah. That sounds, don't get to see a skeleton very often. I said, are they where we can actually see them, or are they buried? He said, no, they're visible. So they had a burial site that they had been very respectful for when they built the museum. When they found a burial site, they didn't move the bones. They left them where they were. And so I'm looking at 4 skeletons of the Timucua chiefs. And I realized, man, these guys are really tall. And I commented to the guy that, how tall are these guys? They look unusually large. And he said, yeah, they're all about 8 or 8.5 foot tall. He said all the Timucas were unusually tall, even the women. And he said, oh, by the way, I've got a painting that actually shows the Indians. I said, well, I'd like to see that painting then. So he pulls that out. I'm looking at it, and it shows the Indians and all their regalia, and they're dancing around and having some kind of a ceremony. And then I see an altar, and it looks a whole lot like the one that I had dealt with in the Middle East. And I'm looking at the picture, and I'm going, is this an altar? Is this stone like something they're sacrificing on? Because this guy's holding babies in his hands in this picture. He said, yeah, they're cutting those babies, they're hacking those babies up in that painting. And so when you look at the detail, 2 of the shamans or chiefs are holding a baby up by the ankles, and they're whacking their heads off and spilling the blood on this altar. And I'm like, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful of your training and archaeological understanding and history, but I don't know of any native tribe that did what I'm seeing here, unless it was an act of war. And this is really, really unusual. And I've seen this type of scene with artifacts over in the Middle East. And I've seen weapons like this over in the Middle East. Well, he was quite interested in that because he loves Native American history, but he's starting to question, maybe I need to dig into this more. That was his comment. So I said, at that point, then I thought, I believe this is why I'm here. I needed to see this and hear about this. At this point, I'm not that concerned about the financial stuff anymore. I'm wanting to know, where is this altar? And so I asked him, I said, can you take me to this altar? He said, I can take you to the altar, but you can't see it. And I said, why can't I see it? Is it buried? He said, no, it's not buried, but it has a house built on top of it. I said, who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar? He said, well, Rockefeller was. So
nice.
We go over there, and he's got the keys, though. So we go into the house, and he takes me into the parlor. He said, you're standing right on top of the altar right now. This is the room that is built on top of it.
Now, this parlor, that's where those guys, J.P. Morgan and all those guys, actually conceived of the Federal Reserve, right? Right over that altar.
That's exactly right. It's the room that they were sitting in when they drew up the entire legislation and plan to pass it that became the Federal Reserve Act.
Wow.
So this was the conception of the Federal Reserve banking system on the parlor sitting on top of a blood sacrifice altar.
You wonder why our banking system and our monetary system is so corrupt? It was literally conceived over a Canaanite blood altar. And Rockefeller put his house right on top of it, and the parlor where the whole thing was conceived of was right above the blood altar. The Federal Reserve. Talk about a creature from Jekyll Island. G. Edward Griffin, I don't think even knows about that. But his title for his book was appropriate for sure.
If the world of 1916 was complex.
Then you have in 1918, specifically in January through March of 1918, famed occultist Aleister Crowley, you guys know who this guy is? Yeah, began a series of magical experiments called the Amelantra workings, in which he was said to have opened a portal to another dimension, allowing an entity, I believe a demon, named Lamb to enter through it. And this is the picture that he drew in 1918 of this entity. Looks remarkably similar to what we would consider an alien gray in today's pop culture. 1918.
Eugenics started here. What is eugenics? Well, eugenics is the whole idea that there are inferior and superior races. And they determine who is inferior and who is superior. The forced sterilization and even genocide of the non-Caucasian weak and crippled began here in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. Our government has a history of taking over people's reproductive future. It's just a fact. This right here is an interesting picture I found when I was looking up eugenics. In the first half of the 20th century, the United States promoted efforts to, quote-unquote, breed better human beings. The pseudoscience called eugenics included forced abortions, sterilization, and other methods of family planning. Where have we heard that term before? Family planning, family planning. Most of family planning consists of killing babies. How is that family planning? Abortion, human sacrifice. This picture right here I found, it talks about the light flashes every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defects. And we see, and every 16 seconds, a person is born in the United States. And it talks about this, in the middle there, it says Eastern States Exposition. I worked at the Eastern States Exposition for 6 years as an audio guy doing kid shows. So this was actually an exhibit from the early part of the 20th century at the fair that I used to work at when I lived in Massachusetts. And I was just looking for eugenics information and found this poster. I said, wow, I used to work there. That's crazy. This was an exhibit there back in the early part of the 20th century. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States and will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. Only about 4% of all Americans come within this class. So they're basically saying only 4% of Americans are worthy. Everybody else falls in the inferior category.
So we had the beginning of the eugenics wars taking place here in our own country in the beginning of the 20th century. And we weren't the only ones. There were other people who had ideas of messing around with genetics. But in this case, with the Soviet Union in the mid-1920s, check out what they were planning to do with genetic engineering.
Sometimes truth may be stranger than fiction. An explosive allegation. Did Soviet scientists try to cross apes and humans to create an army of ape men?
Stalin was willing to do things that other people would cringe from doing.
Was such an abomination even possible?
There's nothing you could do with an ape-human hybrid. They'd rip your arm off.
In December of 2005, a fairly innocuous open editorial article appeared in the New York Times by animal psychologist Clive Wynne, commenting on ape-human crossbreeding experiments conducted in Russia in the 1920s.
I would say that one can speak of the 1920s as the golden age of Soviet science. Anything was possible.
The story was quickly picked up by Russian and European papers, introducing even more explosive information. An article in the Scotsman newspaper stated that in 1926, the Politburo in Moscow passed a request to the Academy of Science with the order to build a living war machine. A new, invincible human being, insensitive to pain, resistant and indifferent about the quality of food they eat. Monster Quest went to Russia to find out how much of the report was true. The results were surprising.
It was a very interesting story indeed.
Kirill Rosinov is a science historian with the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. In 2002, he says that he uncovered documents revealing that in 1925, Stalin approved a $10,000 grant to a Russian scientist, equivalent to approximately $120,000 today.
The Russian scientist named Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov undertook a very strange experiment. Actually, he went to Africa in order to carry out the artificial insemination of chimpanzee females with human sperm.
Rosinov wanted to know how far this experiment went, and whether Stalin or anyone else in the Russian government knew what they were funding. It's possible that they did not, as similar grants to other scientists were common at the time. Although DNA research was in its infancy at the time, Ilya Ivanov recognized the biological similarities between humans and chimps.
The blood proteins were very similar. If the blood cells are so similar, sperm cells and eggs should be very similar too. And that's why he and other scientists as well thought the experiments could succeed.
After the October Revolution in 1917, the Bolsheviks began to reinvent Russia as the powerful industrialized Soviet Union. It was a time of unprecedented change.
The Bolsheviks thought of science as a powerful tool to modernize Russia and also to enlighten the Russian people. This was a window of historical possibility.
According to Rosinov, the documents reveal it was the French who opened the door for Ivanov. The Pasteur Institute gave him access to their primate facility in Conakry, Guinea, Africa. And in 1926, Ivanov's experiments began. He artificially inseminated 3 chimpanzees over the course of a year. The efforts proved to be futile.
On the one hand, he didn't get the hybrids, the viable hybrids. On the other hand, he couldn't exclude the possibility of success, because 3 inseminations, it was too little. Chances for success were rather low.
After several attempts and no pregnancies, Ivanov's strategy took a drastic turn. He wanted to inseminate Soviet women with ape sperm. If Stalin really was looking at apes as the perfect breeding stock for a new soldier, he was correct about one thing. They share the same willingness and ability to make war.
So you got experiments with eugenics taking place in the United States. You got the beginning of transhumanism and the attempted creation of animal-human hybrid armies over there in Russia. And meanwhile, the Nazis are out there trying to create the Übermensch.
The Nazis learned a lot from us. In fact, after World War II, when they were put on trial in Nuremberg for their atrocities and crimes against humanity, they justified their mass sterilization by citing the United States as their inspiration. We learned it from you. And then after the war was over, what do? We brought a whole bunch of them over here under Project Paperclip. Under Project Paperclip, we literally brought over hundreds of Nazis, scientists, and we put them in all the sciences, the field of science, in education, in religion. They thoroughly integrated into our society. The Third Reich just changed their uniform.
Most transhumanists today shudder whenever Hitler's name is mentioned. They chafe at any comparison to Germany's eugenics movement, claiming Hitler's evil intentions were rooted more in a desire to conquer than in a vision for a higher form of human being. And yet, like Hitler's German experiment, the transhumanism movement, if left unchecked, will forever alter humanity's genome and with it, our society. Nietzsche's Übermensch, a German word that literally means Superman, is nothing more than a drive to create a new, improved master race that supplants the old natural man and forever erases Homo sapiens from the planet.
If the world of 1945 was complex.
Then, of course, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls popping out, 1946, 1956, a collection of 981 texts, and among those texts are books like Enoch and things like that show up. And then around that same time, you have Jack Parsons, right, founder of Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Supposedly, Crowley's portal was further enlarged by Jet Propulsion Laboratory founder and rocket fuel scientist Jack Parsons and Scientology and Dianetics founder L. Ron Hubbard in March of 1946 at a location that later became known as Area 51. Their experiment was called the Babylon working, and like the Amelantra working, it was based on ceremonial sex magic. Unlike Crowley, however, they were not as adept at opening and closing portals. Theirs apparently stayed open, and the modern UFO era began 1 year later in 1947, the same year Crowley died. So, I'm just looking at this stuff, looking at the evidence, going, well, is it just a coincidence that right around the same time as the modern era of UFOs and alien abduction activity and all of that just so happens to be at the same time these ancient texts are found that help us to explain and understand what all this stuff really is? I don't think that's just a coincidence. I think God's helping us out here. Again, I'm going to remind you, the days of Jared versus the days of Noah. The days of Noah is what Yeshua said that the last days would be like. The days of Jared were marked by the mating of angels and humans. However, the days of Noah were marked by the creation of animal-human hybrids that brought about the corruption of all flesh that we read about in Genesis 6:12, which ultimately led to God's judgment with the flood. So if I'm just to take Jesus' words quite literally in Matthew 24:37, again, all I have to do is turn on the evening news. It's happening. And we're hearing more and more about transhumanism, which I believe is a doctrine of devils. When you look at the promises of Satan in the garden, Genesis chapter 3, right? It says, "And the serpent said unto the woman, You shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Got three promises there, don't we? We got a promise of immortality. Your eyes are going to be open. You have greater wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and you shall be as gods. You know what I find funny about that? Adam and Eve already had all three. They had it already. Immortality, death didn't come until after they sinned, right? Your eyes being open, greater wisdom, understanding, knowledge. They were walking in the garden with God. Hey, God, how did the Pleiades happen? What's up with the Milky Way? Well, let me tell you, Adam. How much more do you need? Walking with God, the creator of the universe. You shall be as gods. They were already made in the image and likeness of God. Right? So the devil tempted them with three things they already had. They believed him, they fell, and man's been trying to get all that stuff back ever since. And here's the proof of it. This is a clip by Professor Nick Bostrom. Keep these three promises of the serpent in mind. Immortality, greater understanding, wisdom, and be like gods. Check this out.
What I'm really interested in is to try to understand the bigger picture for humanity, our place in the world, and what might lie in store for our species in the future. Particularly the way we might use technologies to enhance ourselves or to go beyond what we currently think of as our human nature, whether it might be by radically extending the human lifespan through solving the problem of aging, or increasing our intellectual capacities, improving our memory, or taking control of our own emotional states. I think that we are right now in a transitional phase where before the end of this century we will either have gone extinct or we will have most likely taken the step to become what you might call transhumans or posthumans, or just very enhanced humans that have reached their full potential.
The three promises in the same order! I'm like, holy cow, look at that. This guy just gave the same exact three promises in the same order. Wow. And if you go to his website and check out what these guys are doing, I mean, this guy is Professor Nick Bostrom, right? Professor of Humanities and things of that nature. And he's got this chart on his website where he says, if you see that the little circle there on the bottom right, that's what's acceptable or accessible to humans. That's what we can see, hear, taste, touch, smell. That's what our senses, what's available to us as humans. The animal kingdom has that larger, darker oval right there. We know that some, animals can see in different frequencies than we can, hear in different frequencies, a sonar of a dolphin, radar of a bat, things like that. They have other abilities that we don't have, right? And he says, well, if we could blend our genes with the genes of these animals and maybe give ourselves some of these attributes, then transhumans could have this big orange circle right here. We could have all kinds of abilities if we start blending them together. And if we keep doing it, then eventually when we all become post-humans, then we'd have this huge oval right here available to us, and we will basically be gods. That's what they're saying. These are some of the brightest minds out there, in science, working together toward this end. We are in the days of Noah right now. And here's further evidence of that.
Plans to allow scientists to create embryos that are part human and part animal are set for approval by the official regulator in Britain. These hybrid embryos are seen by the country's leading scientists as a vital step in the search for cures for diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. It's a highly controversial procedure and is banned in some European countries. Our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh has the story.
This embryo is part mouse, part cow. In a few months, this Newcastle lab is hoping to create a human-cow hybrid. This is highly complex science, the creation of cytoplasmic hybrids, known as cybrid embryos. The starting point is a cow's egg, which is cut open by a laser. The DNA is sucked out. The next step is to take a human cell, perhaps from a patient with Parkinson's disease, and inject it into the egg. Now this is the crucial point at which an embryo is created, because by using an electric shock, the hybrid embryo starts growing, the cells subdividing. In reality, it's smaller than a pinhead, and when it's just 6 days old, the embryo shell is broken open. Inside are stem cells, the body's master cells. The ultimate aim is to reprogram them into any tissue in the body. For example, nerve cells, heart cells, or brain cells.
Inside this barn is a herd of cows that evolution could never have produced.
What a sight! Every animal here is a clone. They're all genetic copies of just 2 original cows created in the lab. They were created by genetic engineering in the hope of saving human life.
Hey!
Antibodies are produced by our bodies to fight disease. They can destroy lethal infections like SARS and poisons like botulism. But no one has found a way to mass produce them until now. Dr. Robles' calves are worth up to $500,000 each. They have human DNA inside them. Their future is to be milked for their blood. This is the world's first antibody extraction parlor. For 2 hours every week or so, these precious cows are connected to pumps that filter their blood and extract human antibodies.
The ultimate goal is to, say, take anthrax, expose the cow to anthrax, and inject it with anthrax, at which point it starts making lots of antibodies against anthrax. And then you can collect those antibodies, purify them, and treat people who have been exposed to anthrax. But it's no easy job to get cows to produce human antibodies. You have to genetically modify the cow's immune system to make it at least partly human. Dr. Roble has had to copy 2 sets of genes out of our DNA, which he then combines into a package called a microchromosome. But to get that microchromosome into the cow, he's had to use one of the most complex cut and paste jobs I've ever heard of.
Take the microchromosome and you transfer it from mouse cells to chicken cells. Okay, and this is a specific chicken cell line that allows you to cut and paste chromosomes. And the best way to carry this chromosome is actually in a hamster cell line. So then it goes to a hamster cell line. We then transfer it to the cow cell line.
So let me just get this straight. To make a human chromosome, you have to go through mice, chickens, hamsters, and then cows.
And then finally cows, yes.
Wow.
Because each cell type has its own peculiar but specific quality that allows us to do a specific kind of manipulation.
These cows take blood donation to a whole new level. Just 10 or 20 of them could supply the yearly worldwide demand for one of Dr. Roble's antibody therapies. And it's the kind of advance that only genetic engineering could have given us. But in order to really take advantage of the technology, we're going to have to embrace it.
We're going to have to embrace it. Did you hear what she said? To get a human chromosome, you got to go through mice, hamsters, chickens, and cows. What did Genesis say? All flesh had become corrupted? There's just one micro example of what's going on right there. I mean, you want to talk about a cow-human hybrid? It's called a minotaur. Shows up in the mythology, right? Or is it myth? Maybe it's real. Maybe it's what I've been talking about all along here. Maybe it's the process of corrupting the image, as Doug Hamp would say, opening up forbidden gates, as Tom and Anita Horn would say, that are bringing about the return of the Nephilim. I mean, they are literally undermining the web of life. Check this out.
They've put spider genes into goats in hopes that they can milk the goat to get spider web protein to make bulletproof vests. They've put cow genes into pigs and made cowhides on those pigs. They had what was called an enviropig, a pig that would have manure that was less toxic. There's a genetically modified salmon that was created by Canadian researchers that was tested up in Canada. They put these frankenfish into tanks and they fed them sufficient food and there was no problem. When they reduced the amount of food, the frankenfish freaked. They started killing and eating their neighbors. So what happens if the FDA approves these frankenfish and let's say they escape into the ocean? I don't know what's worse, the extinction of natural salmon or the roving of these frankenfish going around and killing and attacking other species and changing the whole ecosystem balance.
They both have a mating advantage because they're larger, but they have a survival disadvantage. And it's that combination that, should a male transgenic fish escape into the wild, cause the rapid collapse and extinction of both transgenic and wild fish in as little as 50 generations.
We are now leading the world into the 6th mass extinction of life on this planet. 5 times in the history of this planet, life essentially got wiped out and started all over again. The 5 previous mass extinctions are attributed to things like comets or asteroids hitting the Earth and destroying the environment. We are now deep into the 6th mass extinction of life on this planet. We are losing species of organisms faster than even in the previous 5 mass extinctions. But the source of the problem is much closer home than a comet or an asteroid. Science has recognized that it's human behavior that is undermining the web of life.
Of course, I don't agree with this evolutionary idea of major extinctions. I mean, I believe in the flood, and okay, but look at what they're doing. Yeah, and regarding the EnviroPig, the way they created EnviroPig to create a pig that's less toxic, because how many know God gave us instructions on what is good to eat and what is not? It's not to be mean. It's because he knows how he made and how he created his creatures and how he created our body and what's compatible for it. Right? He knows what's good for us and what's not good for us. And they're called clean and unclean foods. And Jesus didn't change that. He didn't say, you know what, I'm going to just change everything my Father did. Because they're one and the same, aren't they? Yeah, but even secular scientists will tell you pork and shrimp and all the things that are considered biblically unclean foods, secular scientists will tell you the same thing, that stuff is not good for you. So recognizing that pork is not good for us, they tried to create EnviroPig. You know how they did it? They did it by blending the genetics of a mouse with a pig. Well, go read Isaiah chapter 65 and 66. And God talks about those who eat the swine's flesh and the mouse. And that he's going to wipe people out. And God's pretty ticked off. This is in a apocalyptic, prophetic, not yet happened context. And he's really upset with people that eat swine, and specifically now that eat enviro pig. Very interesting. And then there's a whole other side of all this, and that's the corruption of all flesh through cloning and the merging with machines. Part of the singularity in the transhumanist movement. And you got, Time Magazine talking about cloning, and there's this article right here in Time Magazine, the front cover, 2045, the year man becomes immortal. What's going on with that? Well, here you go. Check this out.
We are going to get to the Terminator scenario. That's what I see. Intelligent machines calling the shots. Humans, some subservient slaves is the best. Maybe on farms if we're lucky and so on. Looking at how we are ourselves now, I don't think the future is good. If you are a human after the singularity, forget it. There are certainly some humans that are against having implants, that are against becoming a cyborg and having extra abilities. It's difficult to see much of a positive future existence for them. Clearly, the world is going to be dominated either by intelligent machines or cyborgs, or a combination. That's where the future's going. And as a cyborg, if a human came to see me and it starts making silly noises, a bit like a cow does now, if a cow comes to me and says moo, 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 I'm not going to say, yeah, that's a great idea, I'm going to do what you tell me. So it will be with a human. They'll come in and start making these silly noises that we call speech and human language and so on. And these trivial noises, I'm not going to do those silly things. Why should I? This creature's absolutely stupid in comparison to me.
And as the technology becomes vastly superior to what we are, then the small proportion that's still human gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it's just utterly negligible.
There's more computing capacity in a little grain of sugar when it's nanotech, 1 bit per atom, and flipping back and forth in femtoseconds. There's more computing capacity in that grain of sand than our human brain by a factor of, I don't know, billions or something. So that these machines, if we, humanity, if we decide to build them, we're building gods. Consider the analogy of the way we, as human beings, we look towards ants or mosquitoes as pests. We kill them and we don't give a damn because we feel we're so superior to them. They are so inferior to us. So who's to say that an intellect, which then becomes trillions of times above human capacities, may look upon us in the same kind of way? We could never be sure. As a brain builder myself, am I prepared to risk the extinction of the human species for the sake of building an intellect? Because that's what it comes down to. Yep.
You might remember in part 1 I talked about a lecture by Hugo de Garis. I said it was going to be in part 3, but the way things are going right now, it's probably going to be pushed over into part 4, it looks like. But if you want to check it out, I'm only going to play a segment of it. If you want to see the whole thing, you can go to YouTube and just search for Professor Dr. Hugo de Garis on Who Should Rule, Humans or Machines. A very, very interesting lecture dealing with the coming Artilect War and the whole issue of transhumanism as it pertains to blending with machines and, of course, the coming singularity.
We are fast approaching an event unprecedented in our history, a tipping point known as a technological singularity. When this happens, the world will change forever. I think we should embrace the singularity. You see, fundamentally, I'm an optimist. Optimists make history, not pessimists. So I'm going to come up with a solution that some people, they find very surprising. Today, I want to address one urgent question as computer power races ahead. What happens when the machines become smarter than us? You saw what happened in The Terminator. You saw what happened in Blade Runner. What are we going to do about it? Well, I'm going to give you a radical new solution, and that is merge with them. First, this is the human brain, the most complex object in our sector of the galaxy. 100 billion neurons that can be scanned by MRI, neuron for neuron. This means we can digitize all the information we accumulate during our lives and upload it into a giant mother computer, a vast database of all human knowledge, a resource we could share by downloading programs we want to give us instant knowledge. So when the singularity arrives, we will be in control. By merging with machines, we will enter a new age of superhuman existence. That in the post-human era, we become Homo superior. We become a new species. We're talking about humanity becoming like the gods. What do you think? And how many want to sign up?
Oh yeah, woo! Well, you know the sales pitch is going to be really enticing. You tell me what kid doesn't want to be an X-Men? Right? Yeah, Cyborg or Spider-Man or, you know, any of that stuff. We see it's very appealing, you know, and in Christian, it's going to be appealing to you too. Just imagine, you know, you could download the whole Bible into your head and have total recall and know all of it with every commentary ever written and know Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic and all of it perfectly in 5 minutes. How cool would that be? Just plug in. The sales pitch is going to be there. You know, it's going to be enticing. That's why I think people were willingly engaging in this activity in the pre-flood world. Why wouldn't they? Let's do it. Yeah, that'd be awesome. We'll be like the gods. If you haven't checked it out, go to 2045.com, 2045.com, and read about the Strategic Social Initiative. Or better yet, here's a quick clip. Let them speak for themselves about this 2045 Strategic Social Initiative.
2013 to 2014, new centers working on cybernetic technologies for the development of radical life extension rise. The race for immortality starts. 2015 to 2020, the Avatar is created, a robotic human copy controlled by thought via brain-computer interface. It becomes as popular as a car. In Russia and in the world appear, in testing mode, several breakthrough projects. Android robots to replace people in manufacturing tasks. Android robot servants for every home. Thought-controlled avatars to provide telepresence in any place of the world and abolish the need for business trips. Flying cars. Thought-driven mobile communications built into the body or sprayed onto the skin. 2020 to 2025, an autonomous system providing life support for the brain and allowing it interaction with the environment is created. The brain is transplanted into an Avatar B. With Avatar B, man receives new, expanded life. 2025. The new generation of avatars provides complete transmission of sensations from all 5 sensory robot organs to the operator. 2030 to 2035, Rebrain. The colossal project of brain reverse engineering is implemented. World science comes very close to understanding the principles of consciousness. 2035, the first successful attempt to transfer one's personality to an alternative carrier. The epoch of cybernetic immortality begins. 2040 to 2050, bodies made of nanorobots that can take any shape arise alongside hologram bodies. 2045 to 2050, drastic changes in social structure and in scientific and technological development. All the prerequisites for space expansion are established. For the man of the future, war and violence are unacceptable. The main priority of his development is spiritual self-improvement. A new era dawns. The era of neo-humanity.
After all that, they finally decided to get spiritual. This is real. These are some of the most brilliant scientists in the world getting together at these symposiums, and they're having the 2045 Strategic Social Initiative, and they're doing this stuff. And for many of us, this is well within our lifetime. 2045. And their stated objective is to achieve immortality. And we would say parenthetically, without God. What do we need him for? Where we can become gods ourselves. That's what they're doing.
That is indeed what they're doing, and that's where I'm going to go ahead and stop this presentation, and in part 3 we'll get into the issue of little green men. So stay tuned, there's a lot more to come.